This film is a follow-sequel of the previous Equalizer, telling about a rebellion of a Robert because of his closest friend's death. Starting on a train, looking Robert is reading his book. There he watched a man he thinks is very strange. In the evening, Robert entered the bar to ask for water. But a man who's overseas came to him to feel. Robert immediately drew the man because he knew his ingredients were weird. Suddenly the man stood up and told his 3 children to kill Robert. Here Robert is ready to easily kill them all. Robert immediately approached the man with his fearful face and said that he gave 2 choices of life or dead. On the other hand, a mother is called Grace, ran into the police station to his son. The old man tells him that someone is taking his son 45 minutes ago. Here we can know that Robert has saved Grace's son when on the train. The next day Robert picked up an old man named Sawmill because Robert now became a taxi driver. After that Robert returned to work on a lot of passengers who entered his car. Then Robert returned to his apartment to unwind. On the other hand, the man is called Calvert until his home. But he was surprised to see his wife with a wound on his face. Suddenly, some people named Rash, Nick, Kovac, and TYY came to kill them. But the youths make all that just like suicide. The next day Robert returned to work as a driver. After that he to the bookstore took his order. There he met Grace's son. Robert just told him to remain silent. Night Robert returned to work. But he got a passenger of women who was cut on a man and it made him suspicious. Robert went straight to the address. He says that the card is invalid. After he paid him, Robert immediately said that the woman named Emmy was already in the hospital. After that Robert puts it all in 29 seconds. Unless one is very scared. Here Robert just broke his fingers. Robert then went back to his apartment. Here Robert feels anyone until he prepares his weapon. But it turns out that the person who is in his apartment is Susan. They dined together, so Robert told me about his wife's father named Vivian. Then Robert and Susan walked while talking about the tax-in because Susan had to go to the airport. The Robert's day was surprised to come out to see the woman's own named Fatima spaced and the walls were scorned. Robert cleans the walls little by little, then a teenager named Miles offers his services, but Robert just appreciates his offer. Suddenly Miles came back out and offered cheaper services. Robert agreed it, but Miles did it after going to school. Moving to Susan, Dave and his boss, they are talking about Calvert dead. They are still confused if it's suicide or murder. Because he wants to know the truth, Susan leaves for the TKP in Belgium to make sure. Moving to Samayo, he continues to tell about his brother named Maida and painting at a price of $12 million. When the nurse came, Robert was told if he had ever helped Samayo, but the proof was not too strong to admit the painting was his. Night after the finish eating, Robert asked Susan's help to find info by providing the file. When at home, Robert continues to oversee the work of painting the Miles wall. Moving to Susan with Dave, who examined the TKP, seeing Susan continued to look at the bullets that penetrate the glass. After that they went straight away, while Samayo invited Robert to the house and showed photos of Magda. Back to Susan, after talking to phone with Robert, he intended back to the room. When I want to get into the room, suddenly 2 people robbers beat him. Susan tried to fight, but he was finally killed. Moving to Robert, who was relaxing with Miles, sudden Brian contacted him. Here, Rout's face is seen worried after hearing Brian's words. After that he rushed away from there. Until Robert just saw from a distance, while Dave went to grieve on Susan's death. Then Brian tells of Susan's robbery. But Susan never even wore jewelry except the wedding ring. Night Robert continues to think to check the Susan's phone card. On the other hand, there are some thugs and parties. Suddenly the phone sounds. When he lifted it, the explosion happened that killed them all. It turns out that does it are Compact, Trey, Skin and Airy. The same person who has killed Calvert. Back to Robert, he continues of thinking Susan. If the doorbell goes off, Robert also does not care about it. Though Miles just wanted to return his book. The Robert kept looking at the recording in the elevator that made her suspicious. It was also Robert immediately flew Dave. Dave still does not believe that Robert is alive, though he sees clearly that the bomb has shifted it. Robert just said it was not his death. Then they discussed Susan's death, and Robert showed the results of autopsy with the stab wound in the chest. Robert is very confident that it is not just a robbery. Now they will search the investigation together. Some time passed. Robert, again watching the Miles, picked up some of his rods. After that, Robert returned to analyze himself when looking at the photo of the scene of Calvert's murdered with his wife. Moving to Dave, when at the Roberts' office, contacted him and told me there was someone else at Calvert's house because that killed his wife had a left-handed hand. Robert also told that Susan just wanted to find out who the caller was killer, but he was also killed. While looking for other evidence, Robert saw the work of painting the walls not yet finished. Robert took the weapon and rushed away to bring Miles again, because Miles had joined the Friends gangster. On the outside, Miles was feared because Robert stood his weapon. He just wants Miles to change and be aware of his association. When at home, Miles attached to him. Miles again offers work, but Robert gives books to read first, after it's new. Then Robert returned to work into a taxi driver. But he feels suspicious with the passengers now. After a bit quiet, the passenger immediately took out the weapon. Fortunately, Robert could overcome everything very lie. After that, Robert took the person's cell phone and burned the corpse and his car to remove the trail. Moving to Dave, when out of the house to throw garbage, there is a car that watches it. After getting into the house, suddenly Robert came and gave the cell phone belonging to the person who wanted to kill him. Robert said to bring him to the office because the perpetrator could contact through the phone. Suddenly, Robert immediately contacted the phone. It turns out he already knows that the one who kills Susan is Dave himself. Dave tells us that we are only ruled to kill and forget. But Robert told me that this could not be forgotten, because Susan is his best friend. Then Dave took Robert out to meet another colleague called Ras, Nick, Kovac, and Eric. Dave tells that KNI is not a personal matter. But without the basement of Robert, says he will kill them all, because they have killed his best friend. After that, Robert was traveling Dave's wife to go to the airport. From this time, the war between them will continue. Moving to Brian, he looks he is talking to someone on the phone. But Race, Nick, and Ari come to his house. Fortunately, Robert had brought Brian out before the rest Nick and Ari came. When at the end, Robert tells him that he is pursued by Susan's killer. While in Robert's house, St. Miles is working. Then Kovac was there pretending as an introduction to pizza to get in. Robert told Miles to hide behind the door that composed of the book, because he knows there will be a problem that will come. Robert asked Miles to turn off the cell phone screen because Dave could see it through the glass. When Dave took his weapon, fortunately Robert directly contacted him to distract. After thinking a while, Dave said that he knew where Robert went. After Dave with the others went, Miles is immediately out of his hiding place. But when he wanted to leave, it was Dave still there until he was getting caught. On the other hand, Robert forgot to where it is on an island. Robert asked permission to pass the bridge by showing the identity of the police. Back to Dave, he looks too with his team to the city on the island. When the police came, Dave immediately killed him. Moving to Robert, when knowing the enemy came, he hired directly. While Dave and the other is out of the car with a full armament, Dave immediately climbed the tower to keep an eye on where the existence of Robert with his sniper. From here, Dave began to direct his team to surround Robert. But unfortunately, Kovac was killed for entering the Robert trap. When Resnick came in, he was surprised to see Kovac, who was killed with Brutal. After that, they returned ready to stand by. But when Ari Linga's Torn also killed him, their Rasnik began to be afraid of seeing Ari, who was also killed. He asked Dave to tell him, because Robert had messed up them all. Moving to Robert, hiding, he saw Dave who were on the tower. Robert shot electric so he could run home to a home over the street. Here Robert reset a trap. When the race of Nick came, he was preparing at the outside door. After seeing the Robert trace, Resnick immediately threw a small bomb until a big explosion occurred. And Rasnick is also killed because of his own bombs. While Robert continued to run sluggish the towers, but Dave threatened to kill Miles, who was in the trunk of the car. Fortunately, when Dave wanted to shoot Boggess, Robert first shot the car tire, so Dave's bullet was on a hurry. After that, Robert diverted his attention. When Dave stood up, he almost fell from the tower because of his wind. When Dave stands, Robert immediately denied him dying. Roberto dropped Dave from the tower. Then Robert brought Miles to his house to treat his wounded wound. Miles then asked who Robert actually. Robert just silent and not telling anything. When looking at Robert's photos with his wife, Miles realized that Robert's former military was a former special agent. Some time past looks now Miles has changed because he started a new life by schooling. On the other hand, Fatima also enjoys looking at its Gardo tightly with a very nice wall image. While Samayo was renewed with his brothers Mike. To the Robert, on the island he started a new life to continue to remember his wife because the house was the rest of their memories. And the movie is over. Okay guys, thank you for watching. Do not forget subscribe.